Okay, everyone, we're going to keep the video on today to see if me talking with my hands makes anything better for you or a little less boring. Okay, so today we're going to just do a brief introduction to the history of air pollution regulations. This is sort of tying together things we've talked about in other lectures. We've touched on bits and pieces of this, but we haven't done it in a full linear timeline. All right, so just a quick reminder what you're going to do this week. There's going to be 2 video lectures, this one that you're watching now and one on the Clean Air Act. There's one reading assignment, which is the Plain English Guide to the Clean Air Act, which gives you an overview of all the different details, and then your exam number 2. I recommend doing the videos and the reading before you do exam number 2, and you'll see why. All right, so if we go back and look at the history of air quality and air regulations, we already know that air quality has been an issue for many, many years. We talked about acid rain going back to the 1800s, et cetera, et cetera. We really mark the history of air pollution change around 1900 because one of the biggest things that still impacts our air quality today was introduced. It looked a little bit like this. Around 1900, the automobile was introduced. Carl Benz and Mercedes, which eventually became Mercedes-Benz. The growth of automobile use in the United States specifically was almost exponential. It took off very, very quickly. And as we all know, cars are polluters. So between 1900 and in 1909, Los Angeles, California looked like this. This is a Library of Congress photograph that shows smog over LA as far back as 1909. We already know about the Los Angeles photochemical smog that existed throughout the early 1900s, the first half of the 1900s. This is some photos of women walking in Los Angeles in the 1950s. And then we also know about this event in 1948 in Donora, Pennsylvania. This photo was taken at noontime in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948 during their smog event. This event killed a number of people. It lasted for a couple of days. They had a temperature inversion, and the coal factories there were still belching out stuff that they belched out, and this smog event occurred. And we also know about the London type smog events, that one we talked about with, which was portrayed in the Netflix The Queen, this London type smog from coal and chemical combustion. This is just for your reference. The 1952 event was the most severe, where there was 4,000 deaths, but there was a number of these episodes spanning from 1873 all the way into 1962. So these events all together started to give us some forms of regulation. Early 1900s, we see state regulations, one in Boston, the smoke ordinance. In 1910, we also see the first federal level of involvement. The Office of Air Pollution was created. It was eliminated shortly thereafter. It didn't survive very long. By 1920, 175 different U.S. cities have individual air pollution ordinances. So much, what we see is the problem being in individual places, and so it being regulated at individual locations. So we'll see this theme when you look in the next video about the Clean Air Act, this partnership that ends up happening between local enforcement and federal enforcement, being a theme in the way our air is regulated. In 1926, London had the Smoke Abatement Act. In 1940, the number of cities that had ordinances had moved up to 200, so an additional 25 U.S. cities in the 20 years. So we started to see ordinances at about a rate of 1 per year. And then, as you know, in 1947, the Los Angeles Air Pollution Control District was formed, and they started putting permits in place on particular major industries, and that was done at the county level. And counties still play a role in air pollution regulation today. And then in 1952, we discovered how ozone was formed and started to understand that cars and tailpipe emissions from cars were a big part of where ozone was coming from. Okay. So in the 1950s, at the federal level, we had a couple of laws that took place. The first being the U.S. Air Pollution Control Act of 1955, where we see federal technical assistance to state air pollution control boards. So what this did was allow the federal government to do some science on a national level and provide that assistance to the state levels. We also saw the funding of public health services for studies of air pollution at the federal level. This law was amended in 1960 to study the health effects of automobile exhaust specifically. This law, despite its name, the Air Pollution Control Act, did not impose any regulations on air pollution. It still left the regulation to state and local level authorities. So the Air Pollution Control Act was really just a way to federally allow cooperation of the science. So scientists in California could tell other local districts on the East Coast or anywhere else in the country what was the science behind the air pollution. It was not a regulatory act in any way, but it provided funding and federal mechanisms for these studies to take place. So it didn't impose any regulations, and it delegated regulations to the state and local level. Similarly, in 1956, so about the same time, there was a law in England, the English Clean Air Act of 1956, and this controlled household industrial dark smoke emission in London. It didn't put any controls on sulfur dioxide, which was one of the big problems there, and it identified specific rules in London that were considered to be smokeless zones. And it did one of the early control mechanisms. It relocated power plants to the rural areas, so getting them out of the highly populated areas to reduce the impact person to person. In 1959 is when we first see control on automobile exhaust specifically. So the California Motor Vehicle Control Board set emissions rates for automobiles. And the Air Pollution Control Act of 1955 was extended for another 4 years. So it took us into the early 1960s with this no federal regulation, but giving the states the regulatory rights. Taking us into the 1960s. The 1960s was a crazy time around the world, right? Lots of things happened in the 60s. If you think back to a lot of cultural touch points, the 1960s were part of it. Starting off with, Kennedy's assassination early in the 60s and ending with the Vietnam War in the late 60s. The Beatles coming to America, the threat of nuclear warfare, race relations, a lot of things were happening in the 1960s. And at the end of the decade, we went to the moon. So a lot of things also happened in the 1960s with regulation. One of them being the Clean Air Act of 1963, which is often abbreviated as CAA 63. What this did was give the federal government authority to regulate interstate pollution. So we start to see that understanding that local control and local regulation is necessary because the problems locally are very unique, but that air does not recognize that. And so that sometimes local control can't happen without control from a different source. It also, for the first time, set emission standards for stationary sources. It still did not imply any automobile controls. So California was already controlling automobiles. At the federal level, we're looking at power plants and stationary sources, steel plants, things like that, but no automobile controls yet. 2 years later, we saw the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act of 1965. And this was where we first saw regulation of automobiles at a federal level. and they put on emission standards to reduce tailpipe emissions, specifically hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, reduction by 72% and 56%. Respectively. And we'll see this technique a lot in regulation where the laws set a goal to reduce by a certain percentage, and there's a starting point for that. So in this case, it probably used, I can't remember off the top of my head, it said 1965, this is how much is being emitted. By 1968 or 1966, you have to reduce that number by 72%. So the goal was for 1968 model year cars, and it was patterned after California's laws, which had been in effect for cars that came out in the year 1966. The end result of this was that more than half of the cars sold in 1968 and 1969 did not meet these really stringent standards that were set forward. This was followed by the Air Quality Act of 1967, where the U.S. was divided into air quality control regions. So in this period of time, the laws are trying to figure out what is that balance between the federal control and the local control and the interstate control. And so the U.S. was divided into a number of specific air quality control regions, and there were required publications of air quality criteria reports for each region. It also introduced this idea of the state implementation plans, or the SIPs. So the federal government, the whole country was divided into regions. Each region had control over individual states, and individual states were required to come up with implementation plans at the state level. In 1970, things changed pretty drastically, I should say. I'm not re-recording. 1968, you see here the cover of Life magazine, the incredible year, and you see this image of the Earth from above. We talked briefly about this in class one day. This was iconic to you guys. This is something in your life, you and my life. I was born after this. You have always known what the world looked like, and you've always had a photograph to see that from. But until 1968, that wasn't the case. And so a lot of environmental movements started around this time period. And the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 are really what we refer to as the Clean Air Act today. So the original Clean Air Act was the one we were just talking about on the previous slide. It was amended in 1970. And this suite of amendments is really what people think of when we talk about the Clean Air Act now. What this did was create the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA was created by the Clean Air Act. It also implemented the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS, that you are familiar with already, the 6 criteria pollutants, as we call them. It put into effect attainment and non-attainment areas. So basically, this took every county in the country and required them to be in attainment of the NAAQS or non-attainment of the NAAQS. And it separated them into these 2 different categories, which still stick around today. If the air in your place meets all of the NAAQS, you are in attainment and you're good to go. If your air does not meet any one of the individual NAAQS, you are in non-attainment for that individual NAAQ or for multiple NAAQs. And that triggers a series of events that will get you back into attainment, the goal of which is to get you back into attainment. It also provided new source performance standards, and this basically said that for something to be built, a new source to be put in place, primarily this is stationary sources, that there was a standard it had to meet, and it provided national emission standards for the hazardous pollutants. So those 187 air toxics, there is an emission standard that anybody who emits one of those air toxics must meet. And what you can't see there under my video is that it provided congressional control for automobile emissions. So there's categories here: attainment, non-attainment. It's one of the big things that came out of these amendments. The performance standards and the emission level standards, and then control of automobile emissions separately. So by 1970, there's still an understanding of stationary sources needing to be dealt with one way, mobile sources needing to be dealt with another way, and giving some level to each county of whether or not they're going to be meeting the air quality standards. Okay. So one of the things that came out of these amendments did was it triggered a lot of innovation, particularly in the state of cars. The catalytic converter being one of them. And this was the catalytic converter that's in your car today. Went through 3 different iterations, the first being a single bed catalyst, and then a dual bed, and a 3-way. And what this does is it takes the hydrocarbons, the carbon dioxide, and the NOx that your car engine gives out, and it feeds it through a series of, forces it to go through a series of chemical reactions so that your tailpipe puts out water vapor and carbon dioxide rather than carbon monoxide and NOx. And it's a complicated chemical reaction. You don't need to go over it. But what you need to know is that the catalytic converter offered a very significant reduction in emission of the criteria pollutants. Okay? In 1977, the Clean Air Act was amended again, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1977, which provided for prevention of significant deterioration in areas that were already under attainment. So it took those 2 divisions of attainment and non-attainment. If you're over here in non-attainment, you still got to get yourself to attainment. That is your goal, to get yourself to attainment. If you're in attainment, whereas in 1970, it was just, hey, you're okay, you're meeting the pollutant criteria, you're good to go. It added a new regulation on that, which was that in those regions, you needed to prevent significant deterioration. So you had good air quality, you had to make sure it wasn't getting worse. And each of the attainment areas was put into one of 3 categories for source regulation or new source regulation. Class 1 were places that were in attainment and were pristine. These are places like our national park, wilderness regions. If you are classified as a Class 1 area under the Clean Air Act, no new sources can be put in that will impact you. Class 2 were places that were in attainment pretty well, and so were allowed moderate changes, but they needed some regulation on those moderate changes. And in Class 3 areas, you could have no limitations on growth as long as the NAAQS were not exceeded. Another big thing in this time was computer modeling, which was mandated to check whether new pollution sources might result in standard exceedance. So what this means is that you would run a computer model to determine what the air would look like in the future. It also allowed control of CFCs, or those chlorofluorocarbons, for protection of the ozone layer. Just last slide here. The next amendments to the Clean Air Act occurred in 1990. By 1990, so awesome. Okay, let me finish this. In 1990, there was, I'm not going to edit that out because that's just too much work, guys. 1990, there was 96 cities still in violation of the ozone NAAQS. So the non-attainment areas were further divided into 6 categories. So basically, there was 96 places that were in non-attainment, and after 20-ish years of making plans to get into attainment, they still weren't there. So we gave them different deadlines and sort of let that be reassessed. Extreme areas had to meet attainment by 2010. They were given another 20 years to do it. Severe areas by 2007 And then that says severe, but I think it's mild areas had till 2005 to meet their attainment standards. New sources in those areas, there's some new language that came in 1990, the lowest achievable emissions rate by adopting reasonably achievable control technology. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. And then we also went on to that a little bit more extra control of the hazardous air pollutants by setting emissions limits using maximum achievable control technologies, and provided some more control for CFCs. Basically, you can think of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 as a recognition that between 1970 and 1977, and then again by 1990, so the past 13 years, we weren't doing good enough because it was too hard to reach the standards that we met. So this was putting in some more realistic understanding of how we could get the air clean. Okay, so you're done watching this video. Click on through and read the Plain English Guide to the Clean Air Act, and then I will hook up with you again in the next video. Have a great one.